did Jesus have to die? Now, I'm not calling God into question. The course of action that he took to redeem humanity was perfect. I'm not here to debate that. I ask why Jesus had to die from the point of view of someone who maybe has never heard of it before. They don't understand it. I mean, let's face it, if you've never heard of the gospel before, the whole thing does sound a little weird. Why did God do it this way? That's what I'm going to attempt to answer in a non-awful way right now. Could you have stumbled your way through that intro anymore? Hey everybody, Jake here. Welcome to Rogue Nation, where you can learn more about the Christian faith and how to pwn critics, dog. I'm just kidding. I try not to be sarcastic, but I do have a 9-year-old and I can't help it. In this video series, I'm discussing 20 essential questions that every Christian should have an answer for. Now, these aren't the only questions that Christians should have answers for, and my answers certainly aren't the best answers or the only answers, but I hope that what I present in these videos are answers that give you an idea on how to formulate your own response to some of these questions. Like this whole Jesus fella. Why did he have to die on a cross? I mean, you could ask a bunch of people this question and get a variety of different answers. Even among some Christians, there are those who don't fully understand why Jesus had to die to begin with. And then there's the whole question of why couldn't God have found another way? Before I unpack the big fat why behind the death of Jesus, it's worth examining why we ourselves die. When God created the earth and put humanity on solid ground, the Garden of Eden that he created was very good. There was no sin, there was no death. God gave Adam and Eve everything that they needed to live forever and multiply and be happy in a state of total bliss. One of the greatest blessings that God gave them was freedom. God didn't want his creation to act like robots. He didn't want puppets on a string who just did everything that he told them to do. God is not a dictator, because that would make him unloving, and God is love. So he gave us the ability to choose. I heard someone recently ask how Adam and Eve could have sinned if they had no knowledge of good and evil, and I thought, that's a very interesting mental exercise. Let me think about this. God told them not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So does that mean that they had no knowledge of good and evil prior to that? If that's the case, how could they be held accountable for their choices when they didn't even know what it meant to do something wrong? Well, they must have had some idea of what was wrong because God told them not to eat of the tree. He gave them a law, one rule, and they disobeyed. And just because the tree is called the knowledge of good and evil doesn't mean that Adam and Eve weren't endowed with zero knowledge at all. Clearly, they had some awareness of good and bad because in Genesis 3:6, it says that Eve saw that the food was a delight to her eyes. So desire, longing, good and bad were already notions that Adam and Eve had. The bigger issue here is obedience. Either humanity was going to accept wisdom and knowledge on God's terms, or they were going to try and pave their own way. As history shows, trying to pave our own way hasn't worked out too well. Death and decay and rot have become a part of this world because of our very bad choices. So, after the fall in the Garden of Eden, God had to punish humanity for this decision. But why? Well, because he is a just God. He has to dish out the consequences of sin, or he is not a being to be admired. A judge who doesn't hold criminals accountable is not a righteous judge. So if God were to just overlook our sin, that would mean he isn't a good God. Death is the just consequence for sin. The team over at BibleProject.org put it this way. The basic message of the Eden story is this. Humans die because we have, from the beginning, rejected God's offer of ultimate life. God's offer requires a surrender of what we might think is life so that we can receive the true life that God wants to give us. Tragically, we often decide to choose life as defined by our own wisdom, embracing our own self-ruin. Often, these choices seem as innocent as eating tasty, good-looking fruit. But when those choices oppose God's wise instruction, they corrupt life and they bring death. Romans 6:23 says, "For the wages of sin is death, and nothing can free us from death. Death is a binding contract. Once it's enacted, there's no going back. Even good works cannot make up for the wrongs that humanity has committed against the holy God. Compared to his goodness, all of our righteousness are as filthy rags." It doesn't matter if you commit obvious sins like murder or rape or thievery, or the hidden sins like greed and hate and jealousy. We are all doomed because of sin. But why Jesus? Why was he the only one who was able to do this? What about Moses? What about Elijah? What about any of the other great holy men of the Bible? Couldn't they have done it? Well, no. And to help us understand why, I want to walk you through the story of the Kinsman Redeemer. Bear with me for a moment, and then I'll land this plane, and hopefully we'll understand why Jesus is the only one who could do what needed to be done. If you're not familiar with that phrase, the Kinsman Redeemer, you can read about it in the book of Ruth. Ruth's husband died, leaving her without male protection and without an heir for her husband's family line. This was very important to the Jewish people, that every family line continue. But how could someone like Ruth, a widow with no children, accomplish this? In the story, a man named Boaz stepped up to become what was called the Kinsman Redeemer, or family redeemer. This was a tradition in Jewish culture that said if a man died and left his wife without a son, the nearest male relative could marry the widow and provide for her an heir to carry on the family name. Doing this, however, meant that whoever took on the widow as his responsibility had to divide the inheritance of his own children with another family. And many didn't like doing this. A lot of ugly situations arose because of it. But in the case of Boaz, he didn't hesitate. He proved enormously generous and became perhaps the best example of a redeemer in the Old Testament. He recognized his responsibility to Ruth's family. He understood the spirit of grace and humility behind the tradition of the Kinsman Redeemer, and he did what he knew was right. It's a beautiful story that really foreshadows the redemption by way of the cross in the New Testament. But, okay, you with me so far? The Kinsman Redeemer was designed to reclaim lost inheritance for the betterment of everyone involved in the family. Now, let's look at this from a much broader perspective. Adam and Eve lost their inheritance, the inheritance for all humanity. They were placed in the Garden of Eden by God, and their inheritance was supposed to be the earth. They had been invested with authority and dominion over all creation, right? But due to their disobedience, mankind essentially sold himself and his unborn generations and his inheritance over to Satan. Mankind lost his standing with God, and that's when sin and sickness, disease, death, and all that junk entered the picture. Human beings forfeited the title deed of earth until a kinsman redeemer could come along to bring humanity back to its rightful inheritance. All right? You still with me? This is going to get really good. Okay, watch this. Jewish tradition said that the kinsman redeemer had to be a near relative, a near kinsman of the one needing redemption. He also had to be qualified, meaning he had to be willing and financially able to fulfill the part of the redeemer. Mankind was incapable of being its own kinsman redeemer. We didn't have the ability. We didn't have the power. We couldn't pay the debt being the cost of blood to cleanse our sins. We couldn't live up to God's moral law. We couldn't even follow 10 simple commandments. Human beings are steeped in sin. This is why Moses couldn't do it, or Abraham. This is why no other human being in history could do it. So the Redeemer needed to be this impossible person. Someone related to humanity, yet outside of humanity. This person could only come from God, and yet it could not be God because God himself is not human. And it couldn't be an angel or another one of the other creatures of heaven or earth because the kinsman redeemer had to be a near kinsman of humanity. Are you starting to see the issue here? So the answer came in the form of the virgin birth. God made flesh. Jesus Christ. This is why the virgin birth is so essential to the gospel message. Jesus had to be both God and man, or this doesn't work. And this is why Jesus was the only one who could do it. This is why God didn't find a different way to forgive everyone of their sins. The law said that sin had to be paid for with blood, and Jesus Christ was the only one who met all the requirements to do so. Check this out. Number 1, his entrance into the human race via the virgin birth of the tribe of David makes him kin to man. That's one of the 3 requirements. He had to be a near relative of humanity. Second, he had to be willing to play the part of our Redeemer. He knew the cost, he was willing to take on the debt, and he did. He lived a life completely devoid of sin And he did all that to show himself worthy of being our Redeemer. Third, he was able to and did pay the price of that redemption through his blood and death. He paid the price, willingly dividing his own inheritance, his heavenly inheritance, with us to give us a second chance. This is why Jesus said on the cross, tetelestai, which means it is finished. In Greek, tetelestai, I love this, watch this. Tetelestai was a term that was used in business to mean that the debt is fully paid. The transaction of the kinsman redeemer is complete. That's what Jesus was saying. So since Jesus paid the price, he alone is worthy to take back the title deed of humanity. The Bible is the book of redemption. And as the title deed to earth and mankind, it reveals the terms, the conditions, and the details of the laws of redemption and the qualifications needed to earn everything back. The Bible shows all of what we lost, all of what we stand to gain, and all that must happen for us to reacquire our lost inheritance. Jesus Christ is the only one who is able to do that. But the full restoration of that inheritance won't take place until he comes back. And when he does, get this, the inheritance will return to the rightful owners. And who is that? That's you and me. That's Christians. That's redeemed humanity. This is why we are promised a ruling seat alongside Jesus, not because he's kind and he wants to reward us for faithfully serving him. I mean, yes, that's part of it, but the earth was our inheritance to begin with. This will be the culmination of what was shadowed in the book of Ruth and her marriage to Boaz, the kinsman redeemer. So I hope that you can begin to see just how incredible it is, the ways that Christ fulfills the role of the kinsman redeemer and what that means for us. Christians talk a lot about going to heaven and spending eternity with God, but dude, it is so much more than that. It's about reclaiming our lost inheritance thanks to Jesus Christ, our kinsman redeemer. It's called the gospel. And if you want more information on that, I've got a video that breaks down the message of the gospel in really simple terms, both in Christian terms and non-Christian terms. So check that out if you're interested. Guys, this is Rogue Nation, where I hope to help Christians and curious people explore the Christian faith in easy to understand ways, I hope. Please hit that like button. Maybe consider subscribing if you'd like to see more of my mediocre looking mug. Play nice in the comments, and thanks for watching. Until next time.